Great. And obviously we got just a few people attending today, so we can keep this kind of a little more informal if you'd like. And if things come to mind, you can ask a little bit as we move along. But I do want to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Kevin Corwin with one of the co-founders of InScope. InScope is as we're calling it, a CIP planning and management system, and it's all about CIPs and how to make your CIP management tracking information a little more organized, a little structured. And today, actually, what we're going to talk about, this is the first of a six-part webinar series. And what I'm actually going to talk about today is, just sort of general organization of your programs, as we call them, because it's capital improvement program, or could be sometimes capital improvement plan, depending on how your organization defines CIP. Either kind of works. But I want to give you a few ideas, tips and tricks on how to go about organizing your program. Now, a lot of this is going to be demonstrated in InScope, but really, from an organizational standpoint, and some of these options and the things you can think through really apply to just about any platform. And you also see here, these are CIP project stages. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by stages. So these are all the standard stages that I build into when I'm dealing with CIP projects, and have dealt with CIPs for a long time, former city engineer, and then working as a consultant implementing various systems. And actually, with InScope, we give you access to an entire training program, an entire training platform that I'm not going to do that as part of this webinar series, but that walks you through, each and every part, and what to look for, ideas on checklists, things like that, as far as any stage of any project. And so you might see some things, that you could apply. But today we're just talking about programs. So just at the program level and what I really call the power of the program. And I'm going to give you some core philosophies, as far as program management goes, things to think about and, maybe implement into your program management, and talk about program hierarchy, organization, a little bit on funding, little few ideas on projects, how to do some reporting or ideas toward reporting. So a lot of today is overview, and we'll dive into each of these projects, funding, the workloads. We have a whole session on prioritization. So that'll be in the upcoming webinar. So today I'm kind of giving you broad strokes of each of these, and then on each of the upcoming webinars over the next whatever that's going to be. It's there every 3 weeks. So we have 6 of them. So over the course of the next 18 weeks or so, you can, dive into some of these others. So talking a little bit about core philosophies. So these are just ideas. I think these are good things to keep in mind as you approach trying to be more formal in your program management and your project management. Just a few suggestions that I have. First is defining project governance, and that really project governance is the oversight of program and project work. And programs are really buckets of projects. I mean, that's what a program is. It's a container. It's holding all your projects. But sometimes the relationships can get a little mixtured, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But when you talk about project governance, you want to define that. What does that mean for your organization? Want to starting specifically is, well, what does the project manager do? What is the project manager in your organization responsible for? How do you go about defining that? And there's always 3 components for any of these. There's always 3 components, and that is responsibility, accountability, and authority. Every role, and especially at program and project work, but every role in your organization has some aspect of these. And so what you're trying to do, whether through policies or manuals or guidance, or just setting job expectations, you're trying to define, well, how do each of these work? What authority does a project manager have? Can a project manager approve change orders up to a certain dollar amount? What is their responsibility from the leadership and director department leadership structure? What are they expected to do? What are they expected to report? And then from an accountability standpoint, yeah, that really gets into, how do you know that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing? How do you hold them accountable? So you always want to think about those 3 aspects, and that's really what it comes into project governance. So most likely your organization follows some sort of structure like this. And then whatever the leadership structure is, there's again accountability, responsibility, and authority to some form of chief executive, whether that's a mayor or a city administrator or maybe a main city manager, department head, whatever it may be. There's always that sort of structure. And then that chief executive has the same thing. They have certain authorities and they have responsibilities to their oversight body, typically your city council. And they also have accountability. So hopefully you can keep the oversight body um, focused on setting the vision for the organization, making actions, resolutions, granting that authority to the chief executive, and then you're more reporting up. So you can actually, as you define these things, you can actually help your organization with that too. If it's a little less structured depending on what your experience is or what your situation is like. I'm going to drop in the chat here just a few references. So these are project management manuals that help define, from a program and project management standpoint. There's a few references for you. Also, make these available, of course, with the recording afterwards. But I've looked at these over the years. I've developed a lot of project management manuals for departments, and you'll see the City of St. Charles in there as well. That was actually one that I worked on, but I've used these as resources, and it really does help define as an organization. The second is practicing reinvention prevention. So, as much as you can, you want to, and that's the whole point of having systems, of having processes, putting processes in places that you trying to prevent reinventing the wheel all the time, right? So one of the best ways I always think is using templates, setting up as many templates as you can. Of course, I'm going to show you examples of, how to set up a project plan template, but also templates can be for anything, for contracts, right? Construction contract, you're always working from a design template or some sort of template, because, and then if you have sort of one source to go to, but it's also important to remember they're only templates, right? So, I mean, they're not going to fit every single situation. So there always has to be some adaptation. The most important thing is to just start and then adapt as you go. And these also provide process reminders, as you move throughout, like what are the expectations? I'll give you some ideas of those. We'll cover that a little bit more next time at the next webinar. And assuring, the certain things are always considered I mean, these are complex projects that we're doing in infrastructure and important projects. So we want to, provide those things. And then when it comes to progressive elaboration, so I say embrace progressive elaboration. What is progressive elaboration? Well, that is that, you never have perfect information about a project. It is progressively elaborated throughout the life of a project. It actually comes from the Project Management Institute. So it's the idea that I don't know as much as I could know about the project in the beginning. It's sort of analogous to if I'm driving toward a city, right? I can just see over the next hill, and then I get to the next hill and I can see over the next hill. So, and that's what it's like on the life cycle of a project. So you elaborate, and that means then you go back and you update your schedule, you estimate your schedule, or you update your cost estimates. I mean, I don't know how many times I deal with project managers who feel like they have to have everything defined perfectly in the very beginning. But the idea is to have a system in place to where you can keep this information and progressively elaborate as you go. And the last is, just seek progress, not perfection. So as you're trying to implement some of these ideas, or as you're trying to implement a system, even just try to, make progress. It's never going to be perfect. You just want it to be able to be adaptable over time as you learn new things. Okay, so from a program hierarchy standpoint, so again, what do we mean by programs and how do those relate to projects? Well, for the most part, it looks like this. You have, program A, to whatever you define that to be, program B, and then projects 1, 2, and 3 belong to program A or associated to. And then inside of projects, you have scopes of work, of course. You have certain things that are going to be done, design services, right-of-way services, construction, whatever the case is. And so, but you also may have situations where only parts of projects relate to a program. And you need the ability and want the ability to do that as well, to take, well, only this piece of this project belongs to program B in this case. So you have those situations. And of course, a total program, that's all your programs together. That's sometimes called the portfolio, if you ever have heard that term, portfolio. And that means, the total collection of all your programs. And so how do you go about grouping your programs, or how do you go about organizing them, defining them? You can have lots of different options. I'm going to show you some of the options that are available in InScope. you can define programs maybe via funding, or there's certain revenue sources, right? Via if it belongs to a grant program, or maybe you're administering grant programs, certain enterprises, in terms of like utilities is a common one, right? There might be a water enterprise sort of thing. So you can define them that way. I'm going to give you another option on as far as funding goes, just to, again, give you different ways to think about it. You might define them as functional, right? That's pretty common. That's probably the most common that I see, especially for municipalities in terms of streets, water, sewer, survey. Those are individual programs, and the projects then belong to those based on the type of project it is. But you can't have crossover between them, of course. Might do it by location, right? Based on jurisdictions or regions, and I'll show you some examples of that. Or if it's more of an industrial sort of organization, or a university, or even a private commercial contractor, right, or commercial developer, they might do it via markets like residential or rental. Or if it was again, a university might do it by certain departments, the science wing or the math area, whatever it may be. So a lot of different options where the way you define and organize programs and projects. I'm going to show you how some of these work inside of InScope. So in InScope, so this is the main navigation inside of InScope. I think, yeah, most of you are familiar with this already, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But for purposes of the recording, you have the projects area. That's where you define projects and go look at project records. The budgets area, that's of course where you build out what budgets there are for programs and projects. Workloads, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And we do have options for things like timesheets and expenses, tracking those sorts of things. You may or may not have needs of those, especially more on the agency owner side or the CIP side. And these things can always be deactivated if you don't need them. And then the vendor space and the prioritization space. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that here in a bit. Okay, so in the project screen, so this is where you define a project. Oops, I'm sorry. I was in, didn't want to do that. I was in the system area. I want to work in the system area just to show you how you define programs. Okay, so basically you come in and it's as simple as simply naming the program. You can, of course, assign a program manager, give it a description, and almost everything in terms of system setup in InScope is like this. We really try to make InScope as simple to set up and administer as possible. I feel like a lot of platforms that are on the market are way too complicated in their system and configuration settings. And I realize that a lot of that is so that they can offer, so many different functional and ways of functioning. But many times if you can, and InScope is built to be a little more streamlined product. And that means, maybe days or weeks of implementation as opposed to months and years with some of these really, really heavy programs. So everything kind of works like that. Inside, once you define a program, so you can see this agency, they use the jurisdictional approach. They have programs based on certain regions, jurisdictions. You can also control program access. So that's a little bit about programs. Now, when you go to projects and you define a project, you can associate then that project in total to a program. So you can see here, this demo project here is associated to the St. Louis City program. But I also have the ability to maybe, I have a situation where I have transportation work. I may have transportation work, and that might be the most part of that, the major part of that project and the costs associated with it. I'm associated that with St. Louis City, but also I have a piece of the work that's really managed by or associated to a different team or group or program in this case. And so I've defined that for the stormwater cooperative. And so you can actually see the dollars from that are associated as well. Well, if I, from a filtering and reporting standpoint, if I just want to look at that stormwater co-op program and I just want to see only what is part of that program, you'll see that I can still see that and it'll actually reach across, even though the main project might be in a different program, because I can associate scopes to different programs. So you can see there that it actually reaches across in that way. When I get to in terms of funding, okay, so talk a little bit about funding here. So the idea behind funding, again, inside of the system area, of InScope. If I come over here to the system area, defining funds, I can define as many funds as I want, of course, and it's as simple as building that category of funds. I can change these at any time. If I change them at any time, that's going to change all my projects automatically. So everything is always very linked very cleanly. I can come into any project then, and this is always the way I recommend doing funds. Of course, if projects are more of a one-to-one relationship, like this funding source always pays for this project sort of thing, you might consider not using the funding part of InScope. You might just consider using tags or some other field to for a funding source. But if you do have funds that cross over, I'm actually going to turn off cash flow here. I'm going to turn on funds. If you do have projects that cross over funds or sometimes funded by multiple sources, you can come here. So I'm going to add, I'm going to say maybe this is a cost share. Actually, I'm going to use a federal grant for this one. And what this is going to do, and again, I haven't talked about this a lot, but most of you have already seen the product. We have these sockets. Everything is arranged in terms of relating scopes of work to dollars or scopes of work to schedules, or in this case, scopes of work to funding sources. So here for that transportation work, maybe, that's coming, at least 80% of that is coming from this source. And I'm going to add in another source here for just one of their sales tax sources, add this here. And then I'm going to say for this source that everything else is a fixed percentage coming out of this. This is the other 20%. And perhaps for the stormwater work, they are funding that at 100% there. So I can do it that way too. So now you can see, and you can see as I'm doing that, it's breaking apart the costs that are associated to those various funding sources. And you can also see, I could even do that at any level. So I could, for these sort of roll-up elements, if I just wanted to do everything at one level, or maybe, it's an 80-20 split for all of this construction work, I could tie that entire row to different funding sources. So I can do it at any level that I want, and I can do it for any funding source that I want. So a little bit about funding structure. And that's, again, why I think this is a good setup in any system. Is approach is being able to associate funding sources independently to projects and really details about projects, not just individual project records, but sub records of projects. So okay, so a little bit on definitions, just some key definitions to keep in mind, and you'll hear me use these terms. So I always like to define them. Scope, we've already talked about that a little bit. That's a work, a part, that's a component of a project. It's a sub-element of a project. Status gets a lot of different terms, depending, but it's usually corresponding to some sort of condition, whether that's position or the health, or whether something is on or off target. You can kind of use status a lot of different ways, but it helps to define what we're talking about. Now, I like stages, so I always talk in terms of stages. A lot of people like to use the terms phase, and I'll show you, as you probably noticed here in this project, I'm dealing with design and site control or right-of-way construction, and a lot of people use the term phase, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I always like to think in terms of stages, because a phase can be differing parts or components, because we often refer to, well, this is phase one because it's between 10th Street and 12th Street. And this is phase two because it's between, 13th Street and 14th Street sort of thing. And so I think it's helpful to reserve the term phase for that kind of structure. And then stage is more like stages of a rocket, like all the parts that have to be completed in order to finish a project, or even a phase of a project. A stage gate, right? That can be a separation. And again, that's a good term and practice to use, because it provides a progress point. And then we get in some of the finance terms. We've already talked about funds, and really those are allocated source of funds. And in InScope, we have the concept of funds can be applied to budgets or costs, budgets and costs, I should say, applied to both. In other words, you can break budgets apart into different funding sources. You can break costs apart into different funding sources. So budgets, and the way I always like to explain it, and hopefully it helps a little bit in terms of easier terminology, budgets are determined for projects, usually by some sort of governing authority. Budgets are determined for projects. Costs are determined by projects. In other words, this thing, I got this contract and it's going to cost this much. I'm entering into, I'm bidding this, and when I get the bids back, this work is going to cost this much. Because costs are always changing, because costs can be considered past, present, or future amounts to perform work. So I think those are helpful in sort of defining program and project management terminology for your organization. And then an ideal structure. So I always, if I'm working with a client, I try to introduce this structure because I think it's helpful from an organization standpoint. Now you can see you can always break these further down. We're going to, again, get into this more next week when we talk more specifically about project management. But with each project, you can see I break it into pre-design phase, and again, those stages that I just had on that prior screen: pre-design, design, site control, construction. And inside of each of those, I break into a run-up, or what I call a run-up or a prep, then the actual work, and then what I put on the end, a buffer. I do this from a scheduling standpoint, but I also do it from a cost standpoint, from both sides. And the reason is I have a very specific reason that I use this structure and introduce this structure. Again, that I'll talk more about next time to give you examples, but then you can break however you want to break it down, and you could just use these. I always like the prep period because there's always some procurement often that takes place. Real work doesn't start until after I've did the project or done the proposal and awarded it and gone through all the council approvals, right? So all of that prep work kind of takes place there. And again, we'll talk more about that next time, but this is always the structure that I recommend inside of projects. Obviously, you might have your own, and I'd love to hear your own ideas as well. All right, so from a reporting standpoint, so for program reporting, you want the ability to be able to come to, and you saw it, actually, I got it on the screen right here. I have a still image, to know every project, and especially from a timeline standpoint, what projects are going to consume what in what fiscal years, right? Well, and so we build that right in. And so again, if you're tying your dollars to not just what work is being done, but when the work is being done, then you'll be able to get this data as well. And you can see, you can get in this case, the cost data of every project. I could go to the budget screen and show the same thing, budget data for every dollar in the year in which those dollars will be consumed. And that's the type of reporting relationship that you want to be able to get to quickly. Then from sort of project status reporting, you want to be able to, again, think about structuring your data. And that's, again, why I go back to the stages. I like the stages because that also provides a consistent reporting. I can do this, and I can know for every project. So project one, is for program A, all the projects. Okay, this one's in site control, this one's in design. Not because I said it that way, but because I've built the schedule and the scope structure in such a way that the data is always going to roll up to one of those stages. So the example that I use is what I call our supervision report, in which case, okay, I got every program. So again, I can filter by programs and, exports nicely to Excel. So you can do filtering and sorting as you want to. You can do this on the screen as well. I can see the projects, I can see the project manager, right? So I got some general project data. And then I can see things like, oh, well, there's details. There's things that were supposed to be done that maybe are coming due, or things that are overdue. And so that's kind of alerting me from sort of a red, yellow, green approach. And then I can see just those first order scopes, as we call them, those stages. I can see those stages because I've organized my project like that. And I can see percent completes just for what is the active stage. And again, I know the context from every project because I've organized all of my projects using templates into those stages. So just trying to make the downstream reporting as easy as possible later. Again, and then from a scheduling standpoint, being able to see the sort of relative schedules of every project within a program. You want that sort of easy visibility as well, because it helps you understand the relationship between projects. Well, this is our roadmap report. And so the roadmap report, obviously I got a lot of density between the timeframes, so I could restrict these timeframes down a little bit more if I wanted. But again, I can see every stage, and these are just the top level scope elements. I can see every stage of every project. I can see from a dollar standpoint. So it makes a nice clean report to where I can understand scope, schedule, and costs of every project, where those stand, without having to dive into the details. But I do need a little bit more detail than just the project name. So that activity report, a little bit more at the project level, the roadmap report, giving me then a little viewed one level further, but still being able to see everything relative to each other. Okay. I know I'm getting tight on time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but thinking about workloads. And again, we have a whole webinar dedicated to workloads for an agency. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, we're public agencies or we're, sort of owner agencies. Why do we really need to worry about workloads, or resource management like a client? But the reality is that you do want to know everything that needs to be done. Okay, that's your project plans. When is it to be done? That's coming from your project schedules. Who's doing it? You can then assign this work inside of InScope or other systems. But then you also want to be able to say, well, roughly how much effort to do it. Now, the limitation of a lot of systems is that you have to get very granular, right? You have to get very detailed down to the lowest level sort of scope of work that in order to estimate that once you start building those structures and hierarchies. And I don't know if you picked up on that, but inside of InScope, we actually have the ability, you can put costs, resource hours, anything at any level of scope. And what this is really powerful because it gives you the ability to do the same for resource loading, which means I can do resource loading just at a very, very high level, which is what I used to do when I was a city engineer. So I could do everything at a very high level to be able to say to my city council or to my city administrator, hey, this is all the stuff that has to be done according to my calculations based on where I've allocated changes. We can't get it all done. So we can either do more, we can either do less stuff or we can get more people. And again, it's not about an argument at that point. It's about what is the data telling us in terms of this is all the things we have to do. Do we have enough people to get everything that needs to be done finished in the timeframes in which we want it done? In which case, maybe it is that things get delayed, or maybe it is that you do get more people. You can sort of get both. And so you can have this, and again, I can do this just with the only thing I have to edit on this, it's not completely apparent or immediately, but the only thing I have to edit is at these stages of every project for every person. I just come in here on a quarterly basis and I put in some percentages, roughly what percentage of that person's time it's going to spend. That's the only thing I have to do to get this data. Everything else is all automated, so it makes for a very clean and easy way. And I've done this with some organizations and they really like it. Now, I don't have time to get into some, I think everybody on this call has probably seen this graphic before, or if you visited our APWA presentation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into or walking you through this, but just to say this is the other part of program management is then leveraging the data to get optimum recommendations on CIP. Now, we have a whole webinar dedicated just to this topic coming up. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that now. This is the same sort of sequence I walk you through as an example. So I'll just do it real quick or try to do it real quick. The concept is I got 7 projects, scoring in terms of quantified benefit score from 90 to 30. These are all my annual costs. I could do projects in sort of a best first or worst first approach, but I run out of money. The next option is I could do a cost benefit. That's okay. But if I sort of aggregate all my scores, I only get 3 projects done. And I would find if I let the computer run all the possible ways to configure this very simple example of 7 projects scoring from 90 to 30, although ours, our CIPs are much more complicated. But if I let the computer analyze it and run through all the optimum results, I can actually find the greatest benefit and do more projects overall. So that's what we're trying to do with this. This is just a quick snapshot of the prioritization screen where you can do this work at. And again, I have a whole webinar dedicated to that. So we will cover that last time. I thank you for your time and attendance. Hopefully you got a little bit out of that. I know we just sort of scratched the surface of some topics, but now we're going to, in upcoming webinars, really dive into many of those things that I just talked about from a high level. So I hope everybody has a great day.